Everyone, and welcome to today's PropMoto webinar. My name is Franco. I will be the host as always. I'm editor and co-founder of PropMoto, and today we're going to be talking about multifamily, particularly, the outlook, what some of the data is saying about the outlook. We want to talk about, supply, demand, and a little bit about, how the industry is adapting to it, right? What some of the companies that are trying to navigate these somewhat difficult markets are doing to navigate it. So just a reminder that this is live, and we will be taking questions as you have them. So this is your chance to ask some experts any of the kind of particular questions. I know some of you actually left some questions when you registered, and so I have some of those here too that I'll be going over and bringing into to the fold. So yeah, thanks again for joining, and hopefully we can have a great discussion here about what's going to happen in the next half of the year as far as multifamily goes. It's been a great decade for multifamily. Lots of signs that it is slowing down. Obviously, lots of construction in certain markets, and while we won't necessarily go market by market, we'll certainly look at some of the big trends that are affecting different parts of the country, because it's obviously not a uniform market. So without further ado, I'd like to intro my panelists here. First, we have Manus Clancy. He's from the commercial real estate data firm Lightbox. Hi, Manus.
Great to be here, Franco. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for joining. Next, we have Lee Miller. He's vice president of multifamily at Brevo. That's an access control and smart building company. Hi, good to have you again, Lee.
Love it. Thank you for having me. Appreciate it. Hey, man.
Let's jump right into this. So let's talk a little bit about this on the supply side first, because I think that's one of the big factors here. And you know, for the longest time, that was the thing that was driving a lot of the growth. There wasn't much supply. I know that there was a pretty good. Oh, hey, there we go. Hi, Jay.
Hi, sorry about the delay.
No problem. Better late than never. We were hoping you'd join. This is our third panelist, Jay Libick. He's Senior Director of Market Research at Continental Properties.
Hello, everyone.
Great. So, Jay, we are going to start out here talking about supply a little bit, because I was saying how that is, for the last maybe 10 years has kind of been a fluctuating thing and has kind of driven a lot of the market. So, let's talk about how the supply has changed, right? And maybe what that supply side pipeline looks like, and how that might affect some of the kind of markets and some of the big trends. Manus, do you want to start us out on this?
Certainly, I'm happy to. It's funny, we do a weekly podcast at Lightbox, and I'll start my remarks with a brief warning message for your listeners that I am a completely half full guy. The glass is half full for me all the time, and that may resonate during the next hour, that I tend to see more green shoots than crabgrass as we go through this. But to your point, supply has been a big problem over the last couple of years. Record-breaking new starts, new completions, new inventory in so many markets in the Southeast and Southwest, right? We've seen anemic rent growth, if rent growth at all, in many of these markets. That has made refinancing challenging, proceeds upon refinancing disappointing, valuations coming in at lower than expectation. And when you pair that with higher for longer interest rates and the fact that interest rates spiked so dramatically from 2022 to 2024, that's a lot of headwinds. That's a really long-winded way of me saying to you, and I'll get to this more later, that despite all this, despite what have been really, really heavy headwinds to the market, we're still seeing a market that's functioning. People are buying and selling. People can find capital. There's liquidity out there, and the markets are performing. If you remember what happened in 2010 to 2014, liquidity just completely dried up. It left the room, and people were borrowing, and stealing to refinance their debts. We haven't seen this despite many, many headwinds over the last couple of years, and that makes me very, very encouraged.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I appreciate your optimism. I think that it is rare, and particularly when it comes to media around real estate. And I guess we're part of the ecosystem, so we're partially to blame. But there's so much negativity, right? And there's so many kind of warning signs. Hey, inflation's going to do this, and the war, and all these things. I feel like people have been blasted with so much negative sentiment for so long that I think that we're all just kind of starting to feel like, okay, this is just the environment we live in, right? That's really what I have seen from the people I've interviewed, is that there was money on the sidelines for so long, and it just kept, oh, inflation's going to do this, and this is going to happen, and oh, it's going to be huge political transition, so much that now they're like, we just need to deploy capital, right? We just need to get deals done. That's what we do. We can't sit on our hands forever. There's always going to be these problems. So I think that's a good way to look at it, right? Is to kind of ignore all, yeah, sure, there's plenty of risk, as there always is with any long-term investment, but I think seeing the bright side is certainly a good way to do it. Jay, I'll let you jump in here. I want to just ask you a little bit about what you're seeing as far as supply goes. And I know for a long time, like, the complaint was, well, so most of the supply is the Class A, right? That's what's penciling. I've heard that is tipping a little bit, particularly in some markets. So what are you seeing as far as where supply is coming in and kind of how that looks class to class?
Well, I think that the one thing that I want to mention really quick is that um, we definitely have seen very different reactions in terms of levels of supply depending upon the region. And, you know, unfortunately, the Sun Belt region has seen the vast majority of the supply concentration. And when we look at the Northeast or we look at the Midwest, the a market like Chicago, a market like Detroit, a market like Milwaukee, those markets didn't see that they saw a little bit of an increase in the amount of construction happening, but nothing significant like we saw in, like in Austin or Phoenix or in
Denver.
Denver. And so, the thing that I like to try to remind people is that we look at national statistics, but like when I'm at events, like at the NMHC annual meeting, I have people come up to me and they'll say, like, well, what do you like? And I'm like, well, it depends. Depends on the market and depends on the price point. And so then to get to your other point, yes, I mean, we were seeing for a while coming into the pandemic and just after the pandemic that about 90% of everything that was being built new was typically a mid-rise or high-rise project, and very little garden was being built. But we have seen now where the percentage of garden product being built is up to probably in the 25 to 30% range right now. And it gets a little tricky sometimes because sometimes you don't know in the data, it'll just say 4 stories. So you don't know if that's a 4-story mid-rise with the structured parking or if it's 4-story with, 5 buildings that's elevator serviced. So it gets a little tricky to kind of break that out. But I think that to your point is that developers have recognized that there was a gap in the market and have been looking to fill that with the garden product that's been getting built, on a percentage basis and obviously on an absolute basis more and more across the country.
And do you think that will have an effect? Because I think another interesting thing that you have to parse out of the data is like where the building is going on, right? Is this urban core building, or is this suburbs, or is this experts, right? And so obviously when you're talking about garden, you're talking more kind of on the outer rings of cities. So what are you
Correct.
seeing as far as that maybe being able to influence prices in these suburbs?
Yeah, there's definitely been more interest in going into suburban locations and ex-urban locations compared to say 10 years ago, where 10 years ago there was a very, very strong interest in building into either urban cores or higher density locations, first rung suburbs, walkable areas, etc. So I think that that's been a little bit of a shift. And that, obviously you see that with the product also, you're not going to build you're not going to build a garden deal on a 2-acre site. So we were seeing it in markets like Phoenix, where there was a huge push out to the west into Goodyear and Buckeye in terms of garden product being built. You saw similar things in Austin, where to the south and to the north, a lot more garden product being built. And there was a statistic I just saw where it was showing that the percentage of urban, and I'm not sure exactly how they defined urban in this data uh, separation, but that the percentage of urban properties was actually starting of urban developments was starting to come down. So I think that there's definitely been a focus on those suburban and those ex-urban locations and just kind of a little bit of a shift in the product. But the funny thing is that municipalities still have this huge desire to tell developers that they want to have mid-rise, high-density locations with ground floor retail. And you're like, well, listen, that just doesn't really work in Goodyear or Buckeye or Plainfield, Illinois.
Yeah, you need the density to support something like that, definitely. And I think what you're saying fits into a narrative I have heard, which is that, places without land constraints tend to be doing a lot better, or, are being able to bring on a lot more product right now. Obviously, New York has done a good job with the conversions, but places that can grow outwards seem, like the Denvers and, the Clevelands of the world certainly are growing at a faster pace, I think.
Yes, definitely. Cincinnati is a market, a great example of that, a market that, is hardly ever on anyone's radar for decades. And, Cincinnati has consistently over the last few years been producing really good rent growth, and the number of projects that they have developed has increased, but it hasn't gotten it's still within the bounds of what's needed in terms of housing for that market.
Lee, I'm interested to talk to you just about what you're seeing. Obviously, you guys have lots of clients, with big projects and putting projects up. Are you seeing a lot of kind of smaller garden style, or is it still mostly, large urban towers?
Yeah, I agree with Manis. I'm very optimistic because I think, back to Jay's point, we're still seeing the business come in, but we're just going into different areas, right? It was during kind of COVID and coming out of COVID, it was every week I was in Austin or LA or in New York, and everybody was kind of dumping into those cities. And now I'm going to the Kansas Cities, the Cincinnati's, Indianapolis, some of those sorts of places. And the big cities, I'm living it, right? So I live in Austin. I lived in Austin. We moved out 30 miles north of kind of Austin because we wanted to kind of be out in the country. We overlook our ranch, and now I'm, worried about, somebody coming and building a multifamily development on that ranch because we have the world, the biggest target coming in America to our little town north of Austin, right? So completely agree with both of these guys. And the pockets are really kind of blowing up. You go into these cities and you're kind of put it in Google Maps and you're like, not really sure where you're going. And next thing you know, you're in this, small little town or outside of one of these larger cities. And there's 4 or 5 developments popping up around these retail sites. I mean, this is Texas. We build a high school, then we build houses, and then we build the retail and everything to come with it, right?
Yeah, the
So
football
yeah,
team first.
exactly. So I really see the same thing. I think the problem is that we got so used to, in our side, there's so many projects going up. The developers are kind of just picking a site, building it, and people are filling it. From our side, it was like, okay, we can just concentrate on the major cities, and there's plenty of business to go. I think now everybody's having to work a little bit harder. Everybody's having to think outside of the box. Everybody's going to have to get on a plane to Cincinnati and go check out what they have to offer. Right, there's some great places to live in this country, but COVID era, it was the Charlottes and the Florida and Texas and places like that, and we all just kind of filled in there. So absolutely agree. I mean, we're still touching about 125 to 150 projects per month. So that's everything from retro to student housing to Class A multifamily. So the business is there. People are moving, but I do agree with everybody that everybody has had to shift and think a little bit harder.
Yeah, yeah. And, I struggle a little bit to kind of label growth in multifamily supply as a bad thing. Although I know most of my readers are, real estate owners, and giving back on rent is certainly hard, right? Slowing rent growth. but I do think that there is, it's more than it's a multifaceted thing. I think if you have supply growth that represents economic growth, then it is a good thing, right? And with that, I want to transition into the demand because I want to talk about some places that maybe have done a good job of building, and that building has actually helped them, grow economically, right? And so, yeah, sure, there might be a little bit of rent growth given back, but I think maybe you could make the argument that in the long run, these cities are actually doing better by having supportive policies and, available land and all of the other things that you need to build. So, Manis, why don't you throw me one of a place that you think has grown sustainably and in a way that is helping it economically?
Well, this is a smaller city among the many. It's about an hour from where I live, but Greenville, South Carolina would be in that area. And I would say the three legs of the stool that every successful city really needs to grow is they need leaders that are focused on bringing in new businesses. And here we brought in companies like BMW and Mercedes-Benz and General Electric and or supporting the new economy, things like turbines for data centers is what GE does. We have pharmaceutical companies down here now, which attracts a more upscale workforce. So that's the first leg of the stool. The second leg of the stool is it really helps to be between areas where those cities are almost reaching their limits in terms of growth, like Atlanta and Charlotte. And when you're 2 hours from each one of those, that's a natural benefit. But the third one, which is overwhelmingly important, is quality of life and
Sure.
business climate. And when you see areas that have struggled, and I want to get back to something Jay talked about later, the strength of the upper Midwest, right? How that's been great. Where you've seen cities struggle, it's usually been tied to poor quality of life as well, like a Minneapolis type situation where people are concerned about safety and things like that. And what you have in Greenville, and I say the same thing perhaps about Asheville, North Carolina, maybe they're 10 years ahead of us, is they really focus on all three legs of that stool, bringing in business, being near sources of other income, and having favorable quality of life and business climates.
Yeah, that's a great example, and I think the visionary piece of it is certainly interesting. I'll give my shout out. I think Bentonville, Arkansas, right now, obviously, having Walmart there is part of it, but I'm a biker, and in the biking world now, it has become like a huge destination. The Wall family is all very, very into biking, and so it's one of the most bikeable destinations in the world. It has, I think elevated itself above other communities insofar as it has recreation, it has things to do. I think sometimes small towns struggle with that a little bit, right? It's hard to bring kind of a young workforce in if there's not some sort of recreation or life that they're interested in. So I think that's another good point is that the quality of life and getting people like that is what generates the economy in a city in a way that is better than no growth at all. Jay, why don't you jump in with an example of a place that you think is really grown well?
Well, this is kind of an interesting location, and it's southeast Wisconsin, and the area between the Illinois border and Milwaukee has just seen an amazing explosion of economic growth activity. Um, we saw it early, about 15 years ago. Amazon started locating a number of facilities in that location in the Kenosha area to help in terms of uh, their Chicago distribution and Chicago deliveries. But then other companies started to follow, Uniline, Haribo candies, and then of course we had the huge Foxconn announcement that unfortunately turned out to not happen. But it's created a lot of other activity. Microsoft is now doing a huge project in that location also. And so, the state has, I think, the state and the local municipalities have done a really good job of balancing the growth with trying to make sure that they're providing enough housing. And we have three different projects currently going in that area. We had built a project, two phases, a number of years ago that we ended up selling. That's doing just fantastic. And that to me, I think is a great example of a region that was so on the ropes for so long because it was so heavily entrenched in manufacturing. Years ago, Chrysler had a major um, assembly plant in Kenosha that closed, and so many other areas around Wisconsin that were heavily manufacturing based saw that disappear. But now the region is growing again with different types of jobs. But it's a really great coordinated activity, and you see that demand for housing and that need, and it's being met, and it's a pretty cool, stark difference. If anyone had like not been there in like 20 years, you would be amazed at the change.
Great. Yeah, that's a great example. And I think that goes to show the kind of flywheel you need to have, right? It sounds great to not have, to have supply limits, but when you look at new big companies that want to come in and make factories, they need to know that their needs are going to be met, right? They don't want to move into places where they think, no one's going to be able to afford to live and no new supply is going to come on. So those are great examples. Lee, obviously you could go back to Austin on this one, but what are some of the places you think are growing well?
No, I think just think about the question. Really, if it was me investing, obviously these guys know much more about the finance side than I do. But if it was my personal money, and I travel every week, I'd be looking at college towns. I was in Columbus a couple weeks ago, and I was blown away. Just the change from the last time I was there. There's so much to do. There's companies coming in. Like I said, companies are looking to not necessarily headquarter, but have their, regional offices, those sorts of things in these towns because you got folks coming out of college, they fall in love with the area, and they need jobs and therefore they need housing. So Columbus was one, Madison, Wisconsin was another. Yeah, Austin's always going to be Austin. You have UT there. Everything around Austin's always going to grow. But just throughout my travels, just some of the, not secondary, but secondary in terms of size is really where I would be focusing on. Because there's just, and I think like Jay said, from the government side, renovating some of these main streets and getting bars and restaurants. And, you go on Columbus and you got your pick of a bunch of different restaurants on their main strip right there. And it's
Mhm.
like, it's a good night out. Like, and I said to my wife, I said, it's a nice place to live. I said, as Austin gets, we're always looking what's the next spot, right? If we end up with Austin on our doorstep sooner or later, then we'll be looking to get out of here. But yeah, I would be looking at those college towns
Yeah,
because
that's a
just
great
from a
point.
couple, yeah, the days, the time I spend traveling there, it's just walking around. You feel safe. It's not these big cities. It's places people want to raise families, and you can see the investments from on the multifamily side. So
Yeah, I've been writing recently about some trends of, student housing is actually particularly intelligent now.
yes.
And so I think a lot of people are saying that, this new kind of class of undergraduates and graduates that are moving and getting their degrees are looking into multifamily and particularly wanting to have the similar experience, right? That not, hey, I could go anywhere on my campus with my mobile phone and get in, and like everything is super orderable, and I have community built in with my app and those kind of things that I think the multifamily industry now is looking at these like, oh, if we can capture some young professionals with this technology, it's probably very worth it.
Have you
I've said
seen
that
the
for a
new
while.
have you
Go
seen
ahead.
the new student housing inventory? I mean, I want to spend my golden years in student housing
They're
with my
nice.
wife.
Yeah, they're not the
Yes.
dorms that I
Well,
went to.
so if multifamily builders can recreate that energy as kids come out of school. My wife and I laugh. We want the lazy river. We want the media room. We want the,
Yeah.
24/7 grills outside and the sand volleyball court right outside our door. So, but going back to a point that Lee made a second ago, I think that this is such a major tailwind for companies that nobody wants to plant a shovel in a place that doesn't have talent. And, Jay talked about that southern Wisconsin area. You're near Northwestern. You're near the University of Chicago. You're near UW-Madison, right? You could attract from that talent group. In Austin, of course, you're talking about UT. And every one of these places, you want to be near an institution, the Triangle area in Raleigh, Durham, where people can roll out of school and be job ready, knowing the latest technology,
Mhm.
being able to live near the place where they went to school. And I think that I couldn't agree more with what Lee just said. That is where we'll continue to see outpaced growth in 2026 for the next decade.
Yeah, I think that's a very sticky time of your life. You get a lot of new friends. You have your like I live in San Diego and we have lots of universities. A lot of people would like to stay here and just can't afford it, right? They get an entry level job and they have to move somewhere else. And I think that holds us back a little bit, right? If we had that supply to keep that talent here, I think it would, create a virtuous cycle that, yeah. So again, I think I don't like to look at supply as the enemy, although I do know that it's alarm bells go off for any, multifamily investor when they see a lot of supply coming on. So with that, let's transition to demand a little bit. And obviously there's like the demographic aspect of it, and I think maybe that's where we'll start, right? What are some of these places that still do seem to have people coming and at a pace that is growing demand? Jay, why don't you start with this one? Where are you seeing demand? And maybe I'll give it a caveat of a non-obvious place, right? Don't give me Austin. Austin's out of this conversation now. We already touched on it.
Oh wow, I gotta really think quick on my feet here. Um, so um, one market that has really actually done very well in terms of demand, I'm going to go back to the Midwest on this, is Chicago. So Chicago has seen it's interesting because it's kind of the anti Sunbelt story. When we screen markets and we're looking like, oh, what's going on with population growth? What's going on with in migration? What does household formations look like? And when you look at Chicago, those data points don't necessarily screen well, but the multifamily market has been seeing absorption totals well above the historical averages. In the last few years, their their demand has been well above what we've seen historically. And that to me, I think is a very interesting story. And I'm not sure how many people saw the article in the Wall Street Journal last week about the Midwest, the Midwest kind of comeback in terms of it's low affordability for housing, and there's reasons that people are coming into the Midwest or not necessarily leaving the Midwest as we were seeing previously. And so that to me, I think is a really good story and an interesting place that people again kind of flies under the radar sometimes because it's that the Midwest, flyover mentality in the industry sometimes. So that's the one that I think is a real surprise for a lot of people.
Great one. Lee, how about you? What are you seeing?
I've seen a lot of opportunity, like places like Chicago, but Philadelphia, New Jersey, so even Southern New Jersey, right? My in-laws, my parents are in Southern New Jersey, and like my wife's cousins, and they're on wait lists for projects, sorry, to get into apartments. I think Philadelphia being a union city has always been more difficult to build. So a lot of the large names stay out of there. So, I talked to a lot of my friends that are on the channel partner integrator side. They're like, yeah, we get projects, but they're always on the smaller side. We see you post on LinkedIn that you're in these massive sites. We don't get that in the Northeast. And I think sometimes it's because some of these cities are very difficult to go in and build at. So you have a lot of fill-in properties. But I do think now you start seeing some of the larger companies are trying to figure out how to build there because the demand is so high. Same thing, all you have to do is look at the housing. You're right. So kind of like Austin, the housing's kind of leveled off here. But I talked to friends in New Jersey and their house is still on the market for a day or two and they got multiple offers. And I'm like, this isn't COVID. But I think that just, the multifamily side follows that along. That I don't think there's enough housing in these areas. And people are still moving there because the large companies are there and whatnot. And I think you will start seeing a major shift as companies start thinking outside of the box of easy Austin, throw it up and they will come sort of thing. They start looking at these areas, and I can see that, at least with the projects that we're working on, and especially the new construction, a lot of the larger developers are looking at some of these more difficult places: Philly, Boston, New York, North Jersey, those sorts of places.
Yeah, great point. Yeah, and I think a lot of them are starting to get a little bit easier to build, right? Or at
Yep.
least there's a little political kind of movement in that direction. So hopefully, in the next 5 years, it will be easier.
Yep. Absolutely.
Manus, how about you? What are some cities you think are really growing and have great demand right now?
Well, I'll start with a cautionary one, which is I do think in the South, I still get concerned about how many cranes I see, no matter where I am in the South, and how much new inventory is still being put up between Charlotte and the Research Triangle and Atlanta and everywhere in between. That would be the cautionary tale. But on the positive side, the area that just never seems to, they say it's the city that never sleeps. It's the city that never seems to see any kind of negative rent growth is New York City. And when you think about that over the last couple of years, I think they've had disappointing leadership when it comes to policy in terms of allowing for development to take place, for new stock to be added in. We have had some quality of life issues. There's been talk about negative migration away from the Northeast to the Southeast, from businesses picking up and leaving. And yet, this is a market that, and you do see new supply coming on, especially at the really super high end, but it's a market that never takes a time out, that rents just keep going up and up and up, no matter what the headline says about crime or leadership or negative business conditions or big companies looking to relocate to Miami or Austin or Dallas. It just continues to move higher, and it defies gravity in many ways. But I do want to go back to what Jay said and also what Lee said about Chicago, which when you look at what's being listed now and the prices at which they're being listed at, it is just incredible. Whether it's Chicago proper or the Chicago suburbs, the velocity of money changing hands and the prices that things are trading at is remarkable when you think that Chicago was kind of left in the discount bin 5 years ago when people thought everybody from Illinois is going to end up in North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, right? It's going to be a ghost town,
Arizona.
Arizona. And here you have Chicago just thriving, really across the quality spectrum and across, the CBD to kind of the outer suburbs. So I would throw Chicago in there just like Jay and Lee did.
Mhm. Yeah, it's an interesting one because Chicago has really struggled on the office side of things, especially kind of Central Loop. But they have just tried so hard to get those conversions working. It hasn't, I don't think the way that they have wanted to. I still think New York is the, crown jewel of conversions. Like we have a database for conversions, and it is just, the amount of conversions in New York are far outpace anywhere else. So certainly good on them for doing that. But yeah, it's a hard place to build. I think they also benefit a little bit from the talent. New York just has a talent base, and an industry. I wanted to bring this up because this was a question that came in beforehand about AI, right? And where that's a growing industry, very expensive, lots of high-paying jobs, but it seems to be pretty concentrated, right? So what are you guys seeing as far as that, and the growth of AI? And I'll throw data centers in there too, because obviously you need the infrastructure for it, and how that is changing the kind of multifamily calculation across the country. Lee, why don't we start with you on this one? I know that Texas is a pretty big place for a lot of these data centers, right?
Yeah, Texas as well as Phoenix, and then they take up a lot of land. So what's happening is they are going kind of beyond the suburbs. You're still within distance of that major airport, but they're going out to these smaller towns, building these data centers. I know Jay's got a couple major chip manufacturers going down there in Arizona. And what you're seeing is that not only are they having to build the homes and the multifamily sites, but there's a lot more room because they're going out kind of in, what we would consider middle of nowhere. But then you're also seeing a lot of BTR being built out there. because a lot of those folks that are working in those data centers have, families, and they all need somewhere to live when they first move there. So you have a lot of BTR popping up around there, and then everything else comes beyond that. So I think it's great. It starts to move people out of kind of center city throughout the country. And I'll tell you what, anything that lessens the traffic in Austin, I'll take it.
Europe,
So
bring people somewhere else for sure. Jay, how
absolutely.
about you? I mean, maybe let's talk about San Francisco a little bit. That's been a huge, people had written that city off. It was seemed like it was just the deadest place after COVID. How has AI maybe boosted all ships, raised all the ships there?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. We always I've spent a lot of time in the Bay Area, in terms of previous employer had a massive amount of properties in San Francisco on the peninsula, in San Jose, and on the East Bay. And with so much focus on um, Meta and Google and um, Salesforce, AI was really budding in those locations, and San Francisco has just really taken advantage of that explosion. And I think that, for a region that historically has always been able to recreate itself in terms of how much tech and software has continued to evolve. This to me, I think, is just kind of a continued evolution of San Francisco. And, we saw it with the dot-com bust, and then it came back. And so I think this is
Very cyclical, right?
a great way of just of kind of highlighting how when you have an intelligent base of people and employees to draw from, that the creativity is there to create something and grow it. And I think that that's just a fantastic example right there of how AI has just completely turned the peninsula and San Francisco around economically.
Yeah. I'm always fascinated by the difference between, San Jose and San Francisco. I think it's a case study in, quality of life, right? Where if people would rather sit on a Google bus, for an hour each day than live in San Jose, right? Like live in a little fun Edwardian in San Francisco. It just has much more of civic
But
life.
and I think it's also important to just keep in mind that, you know, San Jose still really is the hardware center. And when we think of chips and we think of all the hardware related, Apple being headquartered there, NVIDIA, et cetera. And that's what really helped San Jose, a few years ago, really start to, outperform. It was doing head and shoulders better than San Francisco. And, now with the AI revolution
Software.
and everything, it's balanced out. But that to me is always, I always try to keep that in mind of like, San Francisco's always been the software side. San Jose is still strong in the hardware side, and that's how they've kind of played off on each other. But yeah, I mean, you know, San Francisco to me is just a great example of, talk about the phoenix rising from the flames.
Yeah, they've done really well.
I'll add to that. I was there 2 weeks ago. We were with Apple during the day and then dinner out in San Francisco. And I've never seen a city turn around like San Francisco has. We had one of the first meetings I attended with Brevo 3 years ago was in San Francisco. And I was just like kind of blown away. The CVS's and the Walgreens and those folks were on their way out. We had dinner. We're walking around in the evening looking for that after dinner, cocktail, and you felt safe again. And it's actually nice to see, and it's actually should be fill the other cities out there that are struggling with confidence. That because a lot of people say, oh well, it's gone too far to bring it back, and some of the issues, those sorts of things. But it's out. People are out and about, and I always said like San Francisco should be the hub of American tourism. Like, especially with us in Texas when it's 110 in the middle of July. I'd love to
Yeah.
be walking around San Francisco when it's 70 degrees. And I think you can actually take your family there and do that again. And I think you're going to see the influx of, the multifamily back into that city again. And it is exciting to see, but I'm blown away how fast they're able to kind of turn that around.
Yeah, it's nice to know that, political changes happen quickly, right? They got a new mayor in and he seemed to hit the ground
Yeah.
running and really did a great job cleaning it up. I want to get in a little bit about, how the industry is adapting to some of these changes. One of the big changes, and this was came from a question that came from the registration list here, is about cost, right? Cost pressure, and obviously this isn't a supply or demand thing, but probably maybe more top of mind than either of those for a lot of owners. Obviously, construction, insurance, labor. How do you think that companies are able to or are trying to keep their NOIs up and stay afloat in some cases, right? With costs not only going up, but looking like they're going to continue to go up. We had inflation numbers come out today, right, that showed that there was certainly some tailwind pressures on costs. Manus, let's start with you on this one.
Well, I'll start with an anecdote that ties back to the previous question on AI and data centers. I was talking to a large operator a couple weeks ago, and he was talking about something that he never would have dreamed of even 6 months ago. But he said, do I have to worry about, this is a rhetorical question he's asking himself, do I have to worry about pairing my inventory and locations due to proximity of areas where data centers are coming in? Because I have no visibility into the cost. People are saying these are going to be huge costs drivers. Who's going to bear this cost? Is it going to be me? And am I going to regret in 5 years not trading out of places that have this kind of cost pressure? Or is all of it going to be borne by Apple or Google or Meta or some of the other ones? And I think that that's a metaphor, if you will, for a lot of the challenges that people are facing right now in insurance, right? We never saw the wildfire problem we saw in Southern California changing the future of Southern California like we did 2 years ago. In Asheville, North Carolina, we saw floods that led to lots of casualties in that area with rivers bridging dams, right? And so I think we're dealing with a time for operators right now where the future is quite opaque in ways that they've never seen before, right? You've been through cycles before. You've seen demand go up and down. You've seen new competition come in. That's what you're built for, right? That's what you were trained to do when you came into this market. You weren't trained for a data center being opened up down the road, eating up 80% of your power, right? That is a difference here. And I'd be curious to hear from Jay and Lee if they're hearing this as people are underwriting these things and if they're starting to ask questions about, how does this influence the future of this project?
Yeah, Lee, I know you work, hand in hand with operators, obviously, and how are you seeing them kind of hedge against some of these problems, particularly like you're saying, the data center next door, right? That could make your power more expensive, your water more expensive, and yeah, labor is potentially too.
So there's that aspect. Like you said, yeah, the labor is going to go up. We're working with folks to figure out how they're more efficient. The other side that nobody talks about that's going to hit us is the chips and the memory. It's 60-70% of that inventory is now going directly to these data centers, right? So we're having to navigate that as a company because we have that, we're storing stuff in the cloud, but you also got on-prem as backup and those sorts of things, and they take a lot of memory. And the cost of that's driving up in computers and those sorts of things. So I think you take all these podcasts with a grain of salt, but somebody said that there's a possibility that an iPhone ends up costing a couple of $1,000s here soon, just based on the memory costs and those sorts of things. So yeah, but we are seeing that. I don't think that the labor thing is obviously directly to the data centers, but it's gone up across the country. So we're getting a lot of questions. It's not so much of that resident experience anymore. It's how we make ourselves more efficient around the things that we do as Bruno. We're looking at like after hour security, the sky high costs there. Some of these sites require 8 a.m. security. We're able to do remote video monitoring. AI is actually allowing us to drop the cost of that rather than having Franco looking at those cameras for 12 hours. The AI is picking up the kind of first mile, and then Franco's then verifying that, hey, yes, there's a problem where somebody's loitering in the parking lot, those sorts of things. So there's both sides of it. I think, you are going to see the increased costs, but with those data centers and the AI, then it's going to allow us to do some things on the operation side to hopefully kind of, not that it'll even out, but it'll help us negate some of that.
Yeah, interesting point about the escalating cost of devices and sensors. The industry right now is, getting told and, seeing signs that obviously modernization is super important. Modern renters want, all of these things, but that's a lot harder to do. And now you turn around and, every smart door lock is twice as expensive or whatever it might be. So yeah.
Absolutely.
Jay, how about you? How do you think, the industry is maybe adjusting to some of these cost pressures?
Well, I'm going to go to the soft side because this is a conversation that I was having with our head of human resources. And, it is becoming harder and harder to staff properties. And turnover is expensive, training is expensive, and we, like many companies, struggle with trying to, find people to work on site, both in terms of maintenance and in terms of the leasing staff. And that's a real problem because labor can be is a huge line item on that expense that expense report every month. And so, and they have a direct they have a direct contact with those residents, with those prospective residents. So that to me is one area that I think sometimes gets um, left out when we're talking about the impact of rising costs, or how are, what are things that are impacting the resident experience. And so it's a challenge, I think, that we as an industry, as Lee mentioned, in terms of, AI, how we can leverage AI to try to help make the staff more productive and maybe take some of the lifting off of their shoulders that they have to deal with right now. But still, you have to be able to have that on-site staff. You have to be able to retain them, and then make sure that they are, leasing your property at the rates that you need, and getting in the profiles that you're aiming for. And it's not easy work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and interesting point that I've heard made is that the one of the problems I think staffing is that these aren't particularly well regarded jobs oftentimes, right? Being a multifamily manager, although it can be a very rewarding career, I don't think a lot of people aren't coming out of college and saying, this is my, direction or dream to do this, right? But I think with AI, a lot of the boring parts of the job are starting to get automated in a way that I think might make it a, an easier pull to tell some, young talented person, hey, you're coming, you're going to be doing community programming, you're going to be liaison with all of the, the residents and talking with them and doing surveys. You're not going to be finding out which key the leasing office needs and, responding to emails that this person's toilet isn't working, right? I think kind of busy work slash top of the funnel communication thing seems to already be being handed over to AI in a way that hopefully will make this easier. I'm always struck by how many people work in this industry, even though nobody talks about it, right? You have New York, I think, they're renegotiating their union. They have a building workers union, and it's, tens of thousands of people that are in this union, and it's like this is an industry I think that is overlooked to our peril, right? I think it's a really important industry, affects people every day. Yet, like I said, nobody, I don't know how we can change that, but I don't think anybody kind of goes to school with the dream of being a multifamily manager yet. I want to talk a little bit about centralization. This is a topic that I have, interviewed a lot of people on, and it's something that's happening. You know, Technology is helping this, obviously, but I think that there is a certain amount of geographic concentration that generally needs to happen, or at least that in people's minds, that's how centralization happens, right? We own enough properties in downtown Detroit. Okay, we can have a leasing building, the leasing staff on one building, the maintenance go around from here and there. But maybe let's talk about ways that centralization is happening, particularly because the beginning part of our conversation, it was about looking at new markets, looking at some of the exurbs, looking outside these little towns outside of big cities and for growth there, right? How maybe centralization can work for a company that isn't super just centered on one, investment area. Lee, I'll start with you on this because you obviously deal with operators a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're seeing that, people are thinking harder and they are looking to either make purchases or they are doing developments all within the same geographical area because that's what they are thinking about long term is that I may not have a staff to manage a site or multiple sites. If I can have a centralized staff, and it's not that they're removing the staff, but you may have the same amount of maintenance people on site, but they may be working in two other sites that day because there may not be anything going on in their home site, right? So a big piece for us is making sure that those staff members can navigate from property to property with no issues, getting access, those sorts of things, and then also monitoring them. We're trying to do, obviously we're cloud-based, so we can monitor any alerts, any sort of data, those sorts of things. Cleaning crews, so essentially put somebody in a central location. Hey, this, the gym on this property is being used a lot more than any other gym. Well, we should deploy the cleaners there first because that's a priority because it's getting a lot more foot traffic. The interesting one that we ran into, everybody thinks AI and you got to think like, oh, it's going to, what's the hardest thing that I got to deal with on a daily basis? That's what I need AI to fix. But there's so many basic things within multifamily that if you start cracking down and start figuring out how to find solutions for them, on a daily basis, the money savings is huge. One of our customers figured out the cost that they were paying for a maintenance person to wait for the plumber that's on site two or three times a week that does work for them, waiting for them, or the plumber arriving on site, waiting for the maintenance person to meet them to get them into the building, then into the units. And we completely automated that. They know where their maintenance tickets are. They're sending out access based on those maintenance tickets. Plumber shows up on site. They work on the units. We have full data to say, yep, plumber was in unit one at this time, unit two, whatever it is. But it's removed sometimes 30 minutes of somebody, maintenance person or the plumber wasting their time on site. And if you start adding that up on a daily basis times all of your sites, the cost savings is huge. So I think everybody, a lot of companies out there trying to, take AI and do all these fancy things and, take the cloud and help in that way. But some of the most basic things you can look at as an operator, the cost savings could be huge just by simplifying that for your site team. And I think that a big part of that is getting on site and really interviewing these teams to find out what are your struggles? How is your day actually spent? Because you'll find there's a lot of time spent doing things that they could either automate or simplify. And it's not reinventing the wheel to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Jay, how are you seeing maybe some centralization happen? And maybe I'll throw onto that, like, are you seeing some concentration of investment in certain geographies in order to maybe benefit more from the centralization?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's all about that concentration of, properties and, you know, um, Avalon Bay just rolled out a new uh, development product that they're touting in terms of they have no on-site staff. And so, I mean, I think that they have three properties that they've delivered recently with this new concept. I think it's going to be something really interesting to watch. But I think that, as when you look at firms that are heavily entrenched in, a handful of markets, you have to really start thinking about, what are ways that we can really leverage the leasing staff, the property managers, the maintenance staff, and be more productive and, get away from the idea of that you have to have, an on-site property manager, an on-site assistant manager, and three leasing people. So I mean, I think it's an exciting area in the business to kind of see how we can figure out the best way to optimize that.
Yeah, and I interviewed someone from Avalon Bay a few years ago, and they're, I think, pretty advanced on just kind of rethinking everything. Like they had I think it was in Pennsylvania, they had a four-story that had no elevators, right? They just had four parking levels that were attached. You would park on your level and walk in, and just that allowed them to kind of have, bring the price point down to where they needed it and stuff like that. Like that's a lot less maintenance. That's a lot less, cost. So rethinking things like that, I think that's one of the interesting things about this, right? Is these cost pressures, I think, are really forcing the industry to innovate. And I think, great ways.
Absolutely.
I
All
think
right,
there's
man.
no telling where this AI takes us, to Lee's point. And imagine that in 10 years, we're talking about the Uber of plumbers, right? That nobody has their own staff or their Rolodex of plumbers. All you do is throw a job on an app and you look how many stars these guys have and you say,
Mhm.
it's at this address and they throw out the radius like your Uber does and they say there's four plumbers in your area and all of a sudden that order goes out, right? And you could do the same thing with an electrician or a cleaning crew. And so does that happen? Does that not happen? Who knows? But whoever thought that we'd be ordering cabs on our phone and have, somebody able to take us to the airport within 5 minutes in almost every major city in the US at half the cost of what we were paying 10 years ago, right? It's just, it's going to be an exciting 10 years to see this roll out. And I think to Lee's point, there'll be really practical applications of this stuff that really take the cost and distribute it more, push it lower, make it more efficient, reduce the number of permanent staff you have in place. And my mind was just alive with all the opportunities that we're going to see.
Mhm. Yeah, and it seems that the renter behavior is supporting this, right? As you're, a part of what makes Uber work is that we are all okay with getting in a stranger's car, right? I think we're seeing renters that more okay with the idea of no on-site staff, doing everything through their phone, connecting through their phone. As we talked about earlier, maybe they're used to that from student housing, and then kind of taking that up through it and even expecting it, right? When they get become a professional and start spending their money on housing. So well, I told you guys that I was going to end this maybe with a quick prediction about what you think is going to happen in the markets. Can be anything, if we came back, let's give it a 5-year timeline. What do you think we'll be talking about as far as, where the multifamily industry is going? Manis, I'll start with you on this one.
Well, if you remember 2 years ago, we were talking about survive until 25. I'm more of the mindset of thrive until 35 now. It's probably hard to find people as bullish as I am right now for two reasons. One is we've taken a lot of body blows over the last couple of years, and we haven't missed a beat. We've continued to develop, we've continued to lend, we've continued to build. And if we can do that when the 10-year Treasury is at 470, what's going to happen when the 10-year Treasury is at 350?
Mhm.
And when tariffs are no longer a concern and the war in Iran is no longer a concern and the economy is back to not having $100 oil. So I think that the rest of 2026, if we can get past the war in Iran, will be the beginning of a nice run for commercial real estate as a whole.
Great. Jay, how about you? What's your 3-year, 5-year prediction here?
I come back to the demand point, and I think that there's been a lot of chatter recently about this idea that, whoa, the Gen Ys are getting older, and how are we going to backfill from the millennials and the like. And the thing that I like to try to remind people is that, you know, the the profile of the renter today has changed dramatically. And, we have to, although young people make up a large percentage of the renter profiles, um, the, the the profiles of people renting today is much, much wider. And people are renting for many reasons. And so the way that I kind of say it is we have to stop thinking of renting as being transitory. And that, so to me, the demand is there and it's going to continue to be there because we're housing needs are evolving, and we have to stop thinking about that it's just young people that are renting and only focus on that that age group of the 18 to 35 year olds. There's a lot more people out there. The depth of demand, I think, is far greater than people think, and I think that because of that, multifamily is going to continue to grow when people least expect it.
Great point. All right, Lee, quickly take us home. What's your prediction?
I agree with Jay. I'm just excited to see kind of these properties evolve, not just new properties, but some of the older properties. I think in terms of the industry, technology wise, we've always been 5 to 10 years behind. But like Jay said, like the renter profile is changing. A lot of people don't want to buy homes anymore. A lot of people are selling those homes because they want to travel in retirement and those sorts of things. And their expectations are a lot higher than, college graduates were 10, 15 years ago. But on the side of that is you also have these college graduates coming out of these fancy, student accommodations, and they're expecting the same thing. So I think you're going to get pushed from both sides. And for my personal reasons, I go out to a lot of these projects, and it's a lot more exciting to see a state-of-the-art property than something that looks like it hasn't had paint in 20 years. So
Mhm.
it's exciting.
Well, great. Without any more, I'll end this. It's been fascinating. I think I've learned a lot. I appreciate all of you. Manis, Jay, Lee, thanks for joining.
Great
Having
to
us.
be here.
Marco.
Bye,
Thank you.
everyone.
Bye.
Cheers.